Hello there, YouTubers. This is Amberola1B presenting another one of my videos for my YouTube channel. Now, this is a Webster Chicago wire recorder that I just received in the mail, and I know that there are dozens and dozens of videos on Webster Chicago wire recorders, either just demonstrating them or repairing them and then demonstrating them. Well, this one has some issues, as you know, do a lot of other wire recorders that people collect that have been untested and that haven't been repaired or serviced. Now, I've already kind of gone through this wire recorder to find out what it can and can't do, and when I first got it, the motor wasn't even turning, so maybe it was kind of like pushed out of position while it was being shipped to me, and maybe it just needed to be, the armature inside the motor case needed to be repositioned. So I finally got it running. It just doesn't rewind very well, and the baler head doesn't bob up and down very well when it's rewinding. It'll work kind of when it's playing back, but not really when it's rewinding. And I did get it to record, as a lot of these wire recorders, when you get them, a lot of times the electrolytic capacitors or just even the paper capacitors are dead on them, and you can't get them to record, but they may play back. But this one does record and play back, and I wanted to demonstrate a little bit to you. The one thing that I will say is that I have to turn the volume all the way up on this machine to get it to record a signal, but it does record a fairly good signal. The microphone itself that came with this machine was dead, but I was able to hook up another alternate Webster Chicago microphone, this one right here, to it, and I have to turn the volume all the way up to make it record, but it does put out a signal. So I'm just going to give you a little demonstration of what this thing can do before the restoration. So I'm going to place it into record and then push it into run. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. This is a test of the Webster Chicago wire recorder. The microphone is either a little weak, or maybe there's a capacitor in here that's weak, because it's not even registering really a signal on the neon light, but it does put out a decent signal. So I'm going to rewind this and play this back. This is one of those wire recorders that you can hear the signal going backwards when you're rewinding, so you can kind of cue it up as to when your recording started and or ended. So I'm going to rewind this now and play it back. Now, it does say in the instructions that you have to put it back into listen or playback, or else you'll probably erase what you just recorded. So I'm going to rewind this now and we'll give it a little listen. But as you can see, it's very sluggish on rewind. I have to kind of turn it by hand, and the baler head sticks. Okay, so that is the start of our recording. Now here we go. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. This is a test of the Webster Chicago wire recorder. The microphone is either a little weak, or maybe there's a capacitor in here that's weak, because it's not even registering really a signal on the neon light, but it does put out a decent signal. So I'm going to rewind this and play this back. This is one of those wire recorders that you can hear the signal going backwards when you're rewinding, so you can kind of cue it up as to when your recording started and or ended. So I'm going to rewind this now and play it back. Alright, and that's what it sounded like. Now, I will take you through a little bit of a tour on as to the inside of this machine, and show you that it is kind of dirty. It needs to be cleaned and serviced before it will run properly. But right now I'm going to just rewind this spool of wire as best I can by hand. It does want to run and rewind, but it's still a little slow, and the head really sticks. I think it's just got a lot of dirt in here, because if you look underneath, you'll see a lot of dust that has accumulated over the years on the underside of this machine. Plus, I think it just needs to be worked to get it to run right. So I had to rewind the wire to get this cover off. I already removed all the screws. And the inside of the top isn't all that dirty. but the underside of it is pretty dirty. And here, as you can see, we have the supply spool table and the take-up table. We have the take-up drive idler wheel, which presses up against this little shaft here, and this is the main motor shaft, so this wheel here presses up against this shaft to drive the take-up, as you will see. Now it's got a little felt washer on top here that should be saturated with oil so it can lubricate the shaft and keep it in good running condition. Some of these Webster Chicagos have a little timer here so you can see how much wire you've used. This model doesn't have it. And when you push it in this position, the main drive wheel presses up against the rewind table to rewind the spool of wire. Now the head only bobs up and down and spools up the wire when the playback is engaged. It doesn't work on the rewind. It also has a little pilot light here so you can see what you're doing when you're threading the wire, but the pilot light's burned out. Oh, guess it's not. I didn't check that before. So that does work. I hope the filament isn't just reconnecting with the poles on the inside of the glass there, but I guess it does work. And plus I'm going to maybe try to service these idler tires here and maybe saturate them and soak them in some brake fluid to try to soften up the rubber, because it does feel kind of hard, and I want it to get good grip when it's rewinding as well as playing back. I'm just going to unscrew that bulb for now so it doesn't blind everybody. I have noticed too that there is some spooled up snarled wire underneath the take-up spool here. You probably can't see it, but I'm holding a little piece of the wire that got kind of stuck under there. That may be one of the reasons why this machine is running a little sluggish when it starts up, but it may not be. But in any event, that has to be removed. Now on other Webster Chicago wire recorders, they have a removable take-up reel, and obviously this model doesn't have one. This whole spool is part of the shaft that goes down into the machine to run for playback. However, the whole spool can be removed by a little Allen screw that's underneath there. But on other models, it just places the take-up spool on top of another table with a lug that protrudes out from underneath the table so it can catch underneath the take-up spool to drive it. And the purpose of the removable spool is so that when you're recording shows that are more than an hour long, you can actually remove both spools when the supply spool has ended. You can remove them both, get a spare take-up spool and put it on that table over here and continue your program. But this model doesn't have that, unfortunately. I have another Webster Chicago wire recorder that is capable of recording more than 1 hour of wire in succession. So that's a good one, but this one I didn't know didn't have a removable table, so this is permanently attached unless you remove that little Allen screw underneath on the take-up shaft. Now we're going to take a look on the underside of this machine and see what it looks like. Alright, this is the underside of the wire recorder showing the take-up spool in motion up here, and beside it is the drive gear that drives the baler head up and down. And right now when I back this up, you can see that the baler head has stuck because it's got a lot of dust on it and probably a lot of dried grease that just keeps on getting stuck when it's going up and down. And I don't think the wiggle room that's in there has anything to do with it, because if it was properly lubricated as well as positioned, it should move very freely. And on this side of it, right here, it's not too visible, but right there is a spring that is supposed to drive that head up and down. It's a very light duty spring, but I think if the head was lubricated properly, and if I put pressure on the head as it's going up and down with my finger, if it was lubricated properly, it should move up and down very freely and effortlessly. And as I said, it only drives, the head only is driven with the motion of the take-up spool. And if the take-up spool was being pulled, or rather should I say, if the wire was being pulled back to the supply spool from the take-up spool, it should move very freely also, but it's not. So this baler head gear assembly has to be re-lubricated as well as cleaned off from all this nasty dust. Alright, and a further look at the underside of the wire recorder shows this little plate here with these contacts and this control switch. This is connected to the switch up top, which controls whether it goes into play or rewind. When it's pressed into play, both of these contacts make contact with each other and allows you to play or record your signal from your machine. Putting it into rewind only makes one contact with these little metal contacts here for rewind, probably so that you can hear your recorded signal as it's being rewound so you can cue it back up. Now here we see two adjustment screws. One is for the take-up and one is for the supply spool to adjust the height of each shaft. And that is very important because if the shafts are out of adjustment and too low or too high, the wire on the spools will not be baled up or rewound properly and evenly. And if they rewind at an angle so that the wire isn't laying flat inside the wide flanges of the spools, it will become tangled up the next time you either want to rewind the wire after it's all taken up on the take-up spool, or the next time you want to run that spool from the full supply spool. And wire is very unforgiving sometimes. It has to be wound almost perfectly flat. It has a little bit of tolerance, but not much. And loosening these two nuts, or each of them individually, will allow you to push that shaft up or down so that it will allow the wire to wind evenly onto each spool, so no damage will occur when it's either playing back or rewinding. Now over here, if I can pull this a little further down and show you, this is the control area of the machine, showing the capacitors and the speaker and the control function knobs. Obviously a capacitor must have leaked sometime because there's all sorts of brown wax on that one tube there, and that has to be cleaned up, and I'll replace those capacitors and make this machine run as good as new as I can. On the back here, you probably saw when I had it connected that I had it jury-rigged with these alligator clips onto the power supply plug here attached to the machine. It didn't come with a power supply plug, so I had to kind of like jury rig it this way just to give it electricity. But anyway, I will eventually get a proper power supply plug and cord for it. But right now this works just fine for me, and this is how I'll run it until I get the proper plug and cable. I have taken it apart and stripped the machine of some of its parts, mainly of the drive wheels and the spindles, and tried to clean the chassis up a little bit of the dust and the grime that was on it. And that's the top part, and here is the bottom part. Now I had to take this apart so I could get to the capacitors a little easier, because the way this machine is put together, let me try to turn this around for you. And if you can see a little bit in there, that the capacitors are kind of like, some of them are tucked way in to the chassis, and so I had to kind of like take the chassis apart in its two sections to get to the capacitors a little easier. And there is one part that I wanted to fix, which I will turn this back over. And it's right here. This is the function buttons, which they serve no other purpose than to prevent the little knob, the function control knob, from going to either rewind or play accidentally. So these little buttons have a spring underneath them that are supposed to be popped up when the machine is either in one function or it's stopped. And unfortunately the spring on this side is gone, but the button is still intact. There's nothing broken off from the bottom that I can see. I don't know how the spring escaped. So what I'm going to do is to drill out these rivets and just remove the assembly, and I'm sure I have a spare spring somewhere that will fit there that I can reactivate this button to pop up so that the little control function knob in the middle will operate correctly. And here's the top part of the machine as I have disassembled part of it. I took off the drive wheel from the motor and then the drive wheel that operates the take-up spool. And I soaked them for over a week in some brake fluid because I heard a little trick that if you soak the rubber idler tires in brake fluid, it kind of rejuvenates the rubber and will allow it to be more grippy to the portion of the machine that it's supposed to be driving. And I did that, and it worked pretty good. In fact, I'll get the wheels here and show you. There's nothing really to see, but that the fact is that on the edges of the tire, I can feel that it's much more grippy than it was. It was very smooth and slick feeling, so it wouldn't have given much grip to the take-up or the rewind spool. So I did that, and it worked quite well. And so I'm going to reinstall them after. But I wanted to show you that, and I wanted to show you also maybe a little bit better view of the head assembly and the little drive gears that make it operate. Now the head assembly only works with the take-up spool in place. So if I turn this spool right here, you can see that the head moves up and down because on the bottom of this spindle shaft here is a worm gear which meshes with let me see if I can get it in view here. Okay, this is the take-up spindle shaft. And as it turns, it meshes with that gear. And it's got an eccentric, I don't know what you would call it, an eccentric wheel, which is kind of oblong shaped. And as the head moves up and down, that wheel will cause, I think you can see it right there. It's got a little, kind of a little point to it right there. I don't know if I can get a good close-up shot of it. But you can tell it's kind of like not in a perfect circle, and it goes up and down, and what that does is to push this lever up and down, which is connected to the head, and the head is just not moving smoothly because it's at an angle. But if it was straight up and down, it would be moving more smoothly as it does right here. And I've kind of cleaned up the assembly and lubricated it a little bit so that it does move much more smoothly. Now right here are the little brake assemblies so that when the function button is pushed one way or the other, this is rewind, so that the take-up spool will have freedom to turn as fast as it needs to while the spool is rewinding. And when you push it from rewind to stop, this little pad here snaps against the outer rim of the take-up spool to stop that spool from turning, and thus to prevent the wire from unspooling and messing up as it's being rewound back to the take-up, to the supply spool. And likewise, if it's in play, the supply spool brake will move out of the way, and the take-up spool pad will have a little bit of grip to it so that when it's spooling up to the take-up spool, it won't just be turning freely, but it'll give a little bit of tension so that the wire will wind up smoothly and tightly onto the take-up spool. And it's really not much of a action that takes place. I'm just exaggerating it by pushing it this far. It probably only moves about that far out of the way so that the reels will move smoothly. So I'm going to proceed to replace the capacitors in the amplifier and get that worked on and back together. As you can see, the electrolytics are kind of visible. This one's kind of visible, but this one's hidden way in back. And they're in cans. So that's why, another reason why I had to disassemble this part of the assembly from the rest of the chassis. Because everything's kind of like hidden way in back to where I got to get it. So I'm going to work on that and show you what it's going to look like when it's all put back together. Alright, and here's the part of the chassis where that little button assembly was. I drilled out the rivets and took the whole assembly apart. And what I'm going to do is use these little flat-headed screws to replace the rivets. Because there's a faceplate that goes over the top here, and I don't want it to be bowed up and lifted off the chassis in case other type of screws like dome-headed screws were used. So these little flat-headed screws will work just great, and I'm going to use nuts on the underside of them. Now, when I told you that I didn't think that the buttons were damaged as to why that one spring disappeared, I found out that one of them was. Now, here's the good one. And as you can see, there's a little thin collar around the top part of the button. Now, that collar keeps that spring onto the button so that it won't fly anywhere. And when it's compressed, this light-duty spring will hold the button down while you're pushing the function knob, but it'll spring it back up when it's not in use. Now here's the other one. Now obviously that little collar around this button is missing, and it probably split in half and disappeared and broke. Now I had another Webster Chicago wire recorder that had the same problem, so apparently those little thin plastic collars were fragile. But what I'm going to do is I have this metal washer that fits around the shaft of this button, and it will act as a collar to hold the spring on. Now this spring is a little heavier duty than the other one that was originally there, but I don't have a thinner, lighter duty spring, so I'm just going to use this one, and it'll work just as well. And I'll show you what this thing will look like when it's all put back together. Well, I thought it was going to be easier trying to repair this little button assembly just by merely putting that washer along the shaft of this broken button to form a collar. But when I tried to reassemble it, the button just fell out. So I realized that just placing the washer on there wasn't going to fix it, so I had to epoxy the washer to the button so that when I reassembled it, it won't fall through the top part of the chassis of the wire recorder where it's supposed to go. So I'm going to reassemble it and then show you how it operates with everything put back together on that part. Okay, as you can see, the buttons are reassembled with the screws and the nuts on the chassis. And as you can see, I placed the light-duty spring on the one that was broken so that the little washer that I put there wouldn't have too much stress on it being held together with the epoxy on the button itself. The one that was in one piece, I put the heavier duty spring so that it will operate because it's still pretty good. When that one breaks, I'll probably find a washer for it and change that one out too. But right now it works as it should. And when the both chassis are put back together, the buttons will pop up and down and work as they should with the control switch. And as you can see, the chassis have been cleaned up. And I replaced all the capacitors except for this one here. It was a 0.008 microfarad capacitor, and I didn't have one for it, but I did test it and it tested good. So it's dead on at 0.008. So I left it alone, but otherwise I replaced all the other capacitors and the resistors, and even those capacitors that were way inside here when I had both ends of this chassis disassembled so I could get to them. And I did test it out. What I did was I connected all the parts with alligator clips and connected both chassis together so that they do run. And now I'm going to reassemble both chassis and demonstrate it to you. Alright, and now the Webster Chicago wire recorder is put back together, and the motor has been reconditioned and re-lubricated. The rubber drive wheels have been soaked for about a week in brake fluid, and now they have more grip to them, and they've kind of been rejuvenated. And the amplifier has been recapped, and the resistors have been replaced, so now it will work for many more years to come. The baler assembly was disassembled and cleaned and relubricated, so now that the baler head bobs up and down more reliably during rewind and play and record. And what I did was, I actually had some parts from an old Webster Chicago wire recorder stashed away, and what I did was I took out the permanently attached take-up spool and I replaced it with a removable one. So now, if I need to record or wish to record a program that's more than an hour long, I don't have to rewind the spool to replace it with another full supply spool to wind onto the take-up reel. All I have to do is remove the take-up spool and the supply spool that's already been recorded on, replace it with another spare supply and take-up spool, and just continue my program instead of, wasting time, because these spools of wire can take up to 10 to 12 minutes or even longer to rewind on a 1-hour spool. So I replaced that, and that's one of my alterations. And then I replaced that broken function button with a good one, so now both of them operate. And I was able to locate a proper power cord for this machine so that I don't have to use that jury-rigged one with the alligator clips on it. So now that is replaced. And I believe that this machine is pretty much all buttoned up and ready to function as it did back around 1948, 1949. Now this is the end of the voice test on this machine. Now I'm going to record a little music from my cell phone onto this wire recorder. Please stand by. Thank you for watching this video, YouTubers. This is Amberola1B signing off, and I'll see you next time with another restoration or just another video. Take care. Bye-bye.